Hello and welcome back to Tottenham Hotspur, the Spurs podcast about Spurs podcasts. It's season 3, episode 2 of this little show that I've been running now, and I can't quite comprehend that I've managed to keep this going for three years. I guess it's more like 2.5 because I started towards the end of the Europa League winning season. But anyway, thanks for sticking with me and all my rambling nonsense. I didn't expect to have a 2-week break between my Spurs Podcasting 101 episode and this, but I got to admit, time just kind of got away from me a little bit. You know, whenever I speak with successful Spurs podcasters, they all emphasize the importance of consistency, just for respecting your audience's habits and trying to play the algorithm, but I still haven't managed to motivate myself to get into that groove yet. So I do respect you, audience, dear audience member, but I haven't respected my own time in trying to carve out a regular day to record this. One day, hopefully this year. So part of the reason I've been so busy is just kind of life stuff happening in the background. My taking a week or so off to spend some time with Iain Jr. We've been cooking up some podcast plans, so you might hear a child's voice on the show in the coming weeks or months. Being on vacation coming up, that type of stuff. So just kind of got away from me a little bit, wrapping up work. Just couldn't find time. I've been trying to get myself out there too. I was on Rule the Roost recently, thanks to Jack for inviting me on. I've been reaching out to various podcasters to try to schedule them for interviews on Tottenham. Been putting a lot of work still into helping Mike and Jonah out with Wicked Spursy. Been on CADS, Come and Discuss Spurs, the live call-in shows with Stu. That's been a lot of fun. God, what else? The Crone Cockerel I was on recently. Their sort of pre-season Tom's teaser episode, which was a ton of fun with 5 other Spurs podcasters, and a big quiz. So go check that out if you haven't already. And the third thing that I've been dealing with is I'm the chair of my local supporters club here in Maryland, Montgomery County Spurs, Moco Spurs Massive, and we've had some turmoil with trying to find a new venue to host our supporters club meetups at. For those who don't know, a lot of the overseas supporters clubs organise get-togethers, watch parties for local fans to watch games together. And for us, the owner of the bar that we were previously watching games at sold the place, and we knew that we'd have to find a new venue to congregate. So me and my mates on the board have spent the whole summer trying to get that together, trying to find a new place, meeting with people, talking amongst ourselves, voting and all that kind of stuff. But very happy to say that we've now found a wonderful new venue. If you're in the Rockville, Maryland area near Washington DC, come check us out. Silver Branch Brewing Rockville Beer Works. Great venue, kid friendly. They've got a pizza oven, pizza kitchen, and they do other snacks too. Great bar menu, huge place, big screen. Really excited. A little nervous, but really excited. So anyway, circling back to this podcast at hand, and not all of my excuses for not getting an episode out last week. We are nearing the end of the summer break. Tottenham returning fully, formed into our lives to dominate our thinking even more than usual looms. We're currently 1 week, as I record this, from Spurs kicking off against Brentford. We should be about just wrapping up the game by about now. It's 1:30 on a Saturday afternoon. And I thought this was a perfect time to go back and look at the start of the window. What were Spurs podcasters saying about our squad when we had just freshly exited the 25-26 season and stayed up? So I'm going to be, I'll talk about the process a little bit later. And first, let's review where we were at as a club, as a fan base on Sunday, May 24th. Tottenham had just narrowly avoided relegation and a £250 million hit to their bank account. That was kind of the estimates that many, journalists and Spurs podcasters who had, either run the numbers themselves or contacted financial experts to assess the damage that us getting relegated to the Championship would do to our finances. We were effectively saved by a Player of the Year candidate, also a loanee in João Paulinho. And another hero game for him with a goal. Speaking of heroes, Roberto De Zerbi, who came in under a bit of a cloud, actually found himself as the hero of N17, and talking about the 12 to 13 players he said he could rely on. So it'd be interesting to see, the way that the podcasters looked at their squad audits with this in mind. Christian Romero had a bit of a tumultuous end to the season, got injured, was out of the country. There were rumours about whether he'd come back or not for the final game. He ended up doing so, but I think that there was a bitter taste in many fans' mouths. We were hearing rumours about other players like Vicario wanting to leave. Mickey van der Ven all season had rumours about him going to Liverpool or somewhere else. There were a lot of body language experts had come out and assessed him in his behaviour and thinking that he was shaping up to leave. We knew that Yves Bissouma, central midfielder, was probably going to see out the end of his contract and leave on a free. That's what ended up happening. Ben Davies was nursing a broken leg and nearing the end of his contract. We also had injuries to Xavi Simons, Christian Romero, as I mentioned earlier, Wilson Odobert, Mo Kudus, Dejan Kulusevski, and probably a few others that I'm forgetting. So a very, very weird squad situation back in late May, early June. We also had a lot of rumours starting to circulate, many of them predicated on whether or not Spurs would stay up. Marco Senesi, Andy Robertson were rumoured heavily, as was everybody's perennial favourite Brazilian who haunts every single Spurs social media account, Savinho. I wouldn't be surprised at this point he's not listening to every single Spurs podcast like I do. Just absorbing Tottenham content. We always say we want players who want to play for us, and that does seem to be Savinho if we can get that over the line. So I went back to 3 major Spurs podcasts to gauge the mood of how people were talking. And so not only did I choose these because they are larger podcasts with larger followings, I should say, the Spurs Show, the Extra Inch, and the Fighting Cock, but I think in many ways they represent different segments of the fan base. The Fighting Cock has a real fan forward focus and presents their analysis of what's happening around Spurs in a more humorous way, and their demographics I think end up becoming sort of the demographics who listen to the podcast end up skewing a little bit younger than the other 2 shows I've mentioned. The Extra Inch sits in kind of a middle ground in terms of that age demographic, is more analysis forward, tactics forward than the Fighting Cock and the Spurs Show. The Spurs Show comes in with a greater interest in the history of Tottenham Hotspur than the other 2 pods. Not to say that those other 2 don't talk about it, but with having slightly older hosts, slightly older guests on the most part, they talk about things from years past, and they look at Spurs from I think across a longer sort of time period when they make assessments and make statements and make callbacks. So I don't know really if I need to summarize the mood too much here post Everton, but there was anxiety, anger, celebrations. These were the dishes of the day. Pretty much every single emotion you can imagine was being expressed across all podcasts, not just the 3 I've mentioned. I feel like in listening back, it was very, very weird to go back in time just 2 months and to think about where we were at that period of time and to relive those emotions, because so much has happened between then and now, but it was a lot of fun. I was surprised to go back and listen and compare each one of these podcasts and how they reacted to the situation. So the Fighting Cock were the most celebratory in my opinion, which was funny because part of the way through the episode, and this was, I think, all 3 of these shows I'm going to talk about were those immediately recorded after the Everton game and with Spurs stayed up. That's what I'm talking here, for the immediate sort of lightning strike mood. But partway through that episode for the Fighting Cock, the host Flav apologized to the listeners in case himself, Thelonious, and Cal weren't being joyful enough, which is really funny because if I go back and compare them to the Spurs Show and the Extra Inch, they were very much engaging with the relief and the joy of pulling it off, not necessarily celebrating the action of staying up and saying that was a good, like being in that situation in the first place was a good thing, but they were really allowing themselves to engage fully with the happiness I feel like they felt and the relief they felt. And that, I think, matches their personalities best, quite frankly, between the sort of show that Flav tries to pull together. Speaking of celebrations, I do think that the Extra Inch won the other end of the spectrum. They were happy, don't get me wrong. Maybe even joyful that we stayed up. But Windy and Bardi, this was an immediate, recording, so Nathan wasn't on the call, were clear that this moment doesn't really deserve a full celebration. We never should have been in this situation in the first place. You can be happy we stayed up, but celebrating the staying up itself was not something they felt that they wanted to do. Windy did call this the biggest game of his life, so they recognized the moment. They recognized the relief and happiness for staying up. But I think there was an awful lot of anger and frustration that boiled through the Extra Inches recording. And they did theirs immediately after the game ended, Bardi and Windy, versus the Fighting Cock and I think the Spurs Show that had a little bit of a delay. So maybe that's why. It was their proximity to things happening. I think the celebration stuff is interesting because although Windy and Bardi, Chris and Bardi, didn't begrudge anybody else celebrating, just saying that it wasn't for them in that moment. And maybe this isn't worth any deeper examination, but people will feel different ways about this. And just the point I want to make here is that something that we've all noticed, I think, as fans, especially online fans, is that there's been an awful lot of celebration policing that's been happening over the past few years. For example, you can't celebrate a goal due to VAR. You shouldn't enjoy winning the Europa League because you finished 17th. And in this case, don't celebrate staying up, because it's beneath us as a football club. Again, I don't think they were policing them, but I think there was some online policing from other places of how to best engage with the moment that we found ourselves in. And my take is pretty straightforward. Feel how you're going to feel. We'll all be fine. So I spoke earlier that on the Fighting Cock, Flav, Thelonious, and Cal focused on the fans. They spoke to the importance of the moment a bit like Chris did on the Extra Inch, saying that the emotion levels were similar to those of the Europa League final. So levels, not necessarily same types of emotions. I found it noteworthy, but they were also the most outwardly focused podcasts, focusing on how other fan bases actively were advocating and celebrating us potentially going down. The number of Arsenal fans popping up around Tottenham on match day, and the days before the game, the coverage on match of the day, stuff like that. I found that the pessimism was probably most obvious on the Spurs Show, especially towards ownership and ENIC. And in general, in terms of their mood, I think Mike and Theo sat somewhere between the Extra Inch and the Fighting Cock, probably a little bit closer to the former. Mike was adamant that ENIC wouldn't pay the wages or fees for top players. This was also said by others, including Cal on the Fighting Cock. But that now this is the perfect time for ENIC to sell. They screwed up, they just stayed up. Capitalize your investment and move on, please, was kind of my summary of that. Theo Delaney agreed, and also suggested that we would be shopping in the bargain bin. We'd be looking for deals to save money. We wouldn't necessarily be making huge squad investments like Arsenal did at their lowest ebb, 5-6 years ago. I did listen to the second follow-up episode from the Fighting Cock after the Everton game, on which it was Flav and Ricky. I think it was a Thursday pod. Flav pointed to Peter Charrington's statement, the non-executive chairman of the board at Tottenham Hotspur, and how his statement about needing to invest in the club was a signal of intent that we should probably listen to and give them benefit of the doubt on. But mostly, or additionally, it gives us as supporters something to go back to and hold ENIC accountable for. So around this time, we were having more and more discussions about what ENIC, Vinay Venkatesh and Johan Langer were going to do. And there was talk, mostly by Windy on the Extra Inch, and Mike and Theo on the Spurs Show, that there needs to be clarity and leadership changes, such as director of football execs, etc., at Tottenham to put our best foot forward from now onwards. General agreement, there was a lot of work to be done. Windy pointed to the Everton game as an example of our lack of depth within the squad and how that needed to be addressed. Now, it wouldn't be Tottenham Hotspur fans if there wasn't some optimism, though. Bardi saying that the Lewises will doing something, it could be exciting. Theo on the Spurs Show also said he was excited about the possibility of one big signing coming in to right some of the wrongs that we've had going on with the squad. So, there is a little bit of, aim high and echoes of glory, even coming through after just staying up. Something that I noticed was absent in these three podcasts, and I don't particularly recall at the time, was that there was an absence of criticism towards Thomas Frank and his time at Spurs. You could argue that the decisions being made really set us up to end up, fighting relegation on the last day of the season. People were aiming much higher. ENIC's door was where they were going. And maybe people were just tired about talking about it, and when they were talking about managers, were focusing on the good that Roberto De Zerbi had done. Okay, so let's go through a timeline from then to now. I've sourced rumours and news from Cartilage Free Captain and Football.London, just two sources, just to get a sort of rough timeline of when things were happening across the window. May 25th to May 31st, the season ended. We had agreements with Senesi and Andy Robertson to come in, and those Savinho rumours were, accelerating at the start of the window. June 1st to 7th, we announced Robinson. We announced Robbo, Van Hecker, Batterina from Como, attacking midfielder, Hayden Hackney. Were all rumours circulating. Vicario going to Juve was on the cards, and most of the audits that I'm going to talk about in a moment were performed during this period. So an audit, I mean, somebody goes through the squad and says who they want to keep, who they want to sell, etc. We're going to be talking about that in a moment. June 8th to 14th, Senesi was announced the day before the World Cup. He then, of course, went off to the World Cup. Which is kind of annoying, if I'm honest. It would have been nice to have him with the squad for the whole of the pre-season period. Pedro Porro and Ben Davies signed new contracts. Basuma left, and a bid for Vuskovic came in from Brighton, who we were negotiating with for Van Hecker. June 15th to June 21st, Van Hecker was announced. We were rumoured to be in for Rashford, Tonali, Fernandes, and Mason Greenwood, which was immediately denied as reported by Alasdair Gold. And it's interesting that the press did try to whip up some Greenwood to Spurs links, which many of us, I think, feared when De Zerbi came in, that Greenwood would be a signing that we might try to make. And we've been over that before. I'll draw a line. June 22nd to June 28th, Dubravka signed. Kinski got a new deal. Cody Gakpo and Brian Broby were linked to us, and Bergvall wanting to leave the club started to bubble up in the press. June 29th to July 5th, Fernandes was announced. Sandro Tonali made a phone call or something to Sky Italy, basically saying that he was going to join Tottenham. João Paulinho sent his goodbye message. Jed Spence had a pretty torrid time against the Congo in the World Cup. He, of course, would go on and become a bit of a hero and a cult hero for Tottenham and England fans. Rafa Leao Krupi rumours were starting to come up, Archie Gray to Newcastle, and we heard news that the Lewis's had sold a bunch of artwork, including some Rothkos, which many people were joking or maybe being serious that money would be immediately pumped back into Tottenham. July 6th to 12th, Tonali was announced for big money. Was that 100 million, something like that? Radu Dragic left. We started getting rumours about Spence going to Everton, and we also had Vuskovic leaving. This was the week of the World Cup quarters, finals and semi-finals. July 20th to 26th, Will Lancashire left. Tynan Thompson, young player, went to Manchester United, and Spurs began pre-season. Romero was rumoured as going to Barcelona, and Krupi got injured. July 27th to August 2nd, pre-season continues, including a 2-1 win over Chelsea, but Roberto De Zerbi comes out talking about a potential bomber signing that he then had to walk back. We had rumours to Victor Osimhen, Omar Marmoush, Scalvini, Atalanta, centre-back. We're starting to hear about those things. Romero going to Inter Milan was rumoured, plus those fuckwits at Arsenal. And we also heard some news about Sousa potentially going to Porto. There was also rumours about Fernandes, our new midfield signing, having torn his ACL, which ended up apparently not being true. But as of right now, I don't think he's returned to playing for us. And we also had some news about players being left off the pre-season tour to protect them, people like James Maddison. I think even Mickey van der Ven, maybe. August 3rd to August 9th, Nicholas Jackson was rumoured as coming to us. Ferran Torres, who ended up, I think, going to PSG, and Balogun, the US striker, were all rumoured as being on our radar. Then August 10th to 16th, we had the news of, well, it's right now. So Jed Spence has just left to go to Inter Milan. Christian Romero has gone to Atletico Madrid. Both of those have now been announced, as has Ashley Phillips to Middlesbrough, joining Will Lancashire. So busy. It's a very, very, very busy summer for Spurs. So this is part of the reason why it's been so difficult for me as a content aggregator and processor to try and get behind a microphone and listen to other podcasts and then sort of relay it back to my audience, because just breakneck speed in the first part of the window, there was just something happening every couple days. You just can't keep up. Your content is immediately out of date, which was like really frustrating. So I'm glad that I had an outlet on Wicked Spursy to share my feelings without necessarily interpreting everything else that was happening. So I did pick up on some themes from this timeline. Essentially, the thing that we all experienced was the early shock and awe of the transfers coming in and the size of the transfers. So we had 6 transfers in 6.5 weeks, which I think ended up making, breaking many of our brains. Just, Theo Delaney on the Spurs Show around this time, sort of halfway through the window, saying that he's never known Tottenham to behave like this, and I think that's a pretty common sentiment amongst many people. Especially because, as Theo pointed out, we're used to a flurry of activity at the end of the window, especially during Daniel Levy's time as chairman of Tottenham Hotspur. And there was all these questions about whether we're finally acting like a big club. This early dopamine hit, I think, gave people a real wake-up call that something's happening at Tottenham. This was even before, I think, many of the other later transfer rumours would bubble up. This was around the time of Fernandes coming in, Van Hecker, Senesi. It was an early question about whether we're finally living up to our potential as a financial, not quite juggernaut, but mini juggernaut. Whether the stadium was going to finally start paying dividends. Another theme that many of you probably noticed is that as soon as pre-season started, our signings stopped. So Reno Wallabout on Blue Sky suggested this was because Roberto De Zerbi had to go back and do his actual job. I think this was tongue-in-cheek, but obviously calling out the uselessness or perceived uselessness of the sort of footballing strategy executives and leadership at Tottenham Hotspur, namely somebody like Johan Lange. I think what's more likely is that they really rushed to get transfers done before preseason and then refocused on the harder to do ones, trying to see what money they had available to make those deals happen. So outgoings had to happen before incomings. Also, we're waiting on other clubs apparently to do their business, like Cody Gakpo, like Savinho. The Man City and Liverpool are both waiting to get players in through the door so that they're not cut short. I also noticed that the transfer rumours did shift up the field from centre-backs to centre midfielders to forwards, which is funny because it was kind of the reverse order of what I think most supporters believed we should be focusing on. At the back end of last year, I had a lot of people talking about the deficiencies in our forward line and getting goals scored, but the club itself seemed to prioritise defensive solidity and then sorting out the middle of the park before now trying to get forwards through the door. But as that dopamine hit wore off, the good feelings and good vibes were replaced by a little bit of nervousness and anxiety, I feel. Especially because we were winning games, but we were not necessarily putting away all the chances we should have in said games. There was also, I think, some worries about what was happening in our forward line. Players being injured or being rested, James Maddison's availability, just kind of bomber withdrawals. People were looking for that hit to keep coming. But with squad limits and cash flow and things that I mentioned earlier, this situation was probably always likely where you couldn't sign a player a week effectively for the entirety of the window. And so as I mentioned just a second ago, the transfer requests that were coming through were the same as always. And so I haven't gone into any real depth on relaying these for you guys, but we're looking for world-class attackers, a passy boy in midfield, and fullback cover, which the last of which was addressed early in the window by Andy Robertson. So in terms of the squad that we came out of last season with, what did Spurs podcasters think we needed to do? Who needed to leave at the start of the window? Who would we need to retain to match our ambitions as a football club? So I surveyed 30 podcasts and blogs, mostly by Spurs fans, but I also included a Sky Sports video, including Flav from the Fighting Cock and a few others that was recorded about 4 months ago, so just before the end of the season. There was also some squad reviews by 101 Great Goals, The Evening Standard, and a guy named Joe Tomlinson, who isn't a Spurs fan. So all these 30 podcasts and blogs, who I'll read out in a second, all went through player by player, saying whether or not they thought that they should be kept, sold, loaned, or something in that kind of ballpark. So, just looking at my list here, including myself, we have the Game is About Glory, Rule the Roost, The Extra Inch, Dr. Tottenham, Last Word on Spurs, Crow and Cockerel, Nice One Cyril, The Evening Standard, Hotspur HQ, which is a blog, 101 Great Goals, which is a blog, and then a whole bunch of YouTube channels, because this is perfect YouTube content. We've got Spurs by COYS, Backpost Pod with Ben Bowman. Ben actually did several. I think he was on about 3. Nick Coy's Corner, Ben Bowman's personal channel, the Sky Sports video that I mentioned, We Are Tottenham TV. Who else have we got here? The Tottenham Way, George Akalea, Seb Martin, Who Is Listening, Oso Spurs, specifically with the coach's view. I already mentioned Joe Tomlinson, Ben Bowman and Fuad, Spurs Extra Time, Sonny Snelling, Rich Footy, who was a YouTuber who was reacting to another Spurs podcaster, or I don't think this guy Rich was a Spurs fan, but he was reacting to a Spurs fan who shared a video on YouTube, so I've included it. Mitch Fresson, Chris Crowlin, and Scarfy Spurs Talk. So those were the podcasts that I surveyed. And to collect data, I use Spotify and YouTube's AI features to categorize which players The speakers, the hosts, thought that Tottenham should keep, sell, or loan. I then spot checked a number of these calls for each episode for quality control, and I do this. I have to do this for work for various things. I found them to be pretty reliable, but it's always worth going back and spot checking and seeing when things make sense or don't. So I'm mostly confident in the data that I'm going to be talking about today, but obviously pinch of salt with text-based analyses, whether or not something might get missed because of how something is expressed. If something didn't make sense, I went back and queried again, and I always use the same query for each pod, and I double-checked a few of them to see if they gave me the same response multiple times. So, however, if a podcast was available as a video and they included a graphic summarizing their decisions, then that was what I used as my source of truth in place of a query. But I did compare them, and they always matched up, which was a good confidence booster. And obviously, blogs were in a handy written format, for which made my life easy. So I went through, I made a big spreadsheet table with every player name, aside from a few youngsters, and whether or not each podcast wanted to keep, sell, or loan that player. Now, the Extra Inch and Nathan produced a really handy tool that broke down each player into different statuses, like whether we should listen to offers for them, whether we would find a buyer. And a few people used this format, but for the sake of this analysis, I did have to collapse these down. So if something was listening, I use that as a marker of lower confidence in keeping them around. So what I'm going to be talking about today are, whether or not players should be kept in the squad or not. Players with more marks against their name, more people, more podcasts and blogs were advocating for some form of moving them on. Whether that be for personal development, like a loan, or to generate cash flow, or because, the relationship between us and the player has broken down, like Romero. So essentially, it's the security of the player around the first team, not necessarily the intricacies and specificities of what we should do with said player, apart from if it was a loan. And I'll call out the loan-heavy responses as I go through. So the most untouchable players. So these were players that had very few calls from podcasters and bloggers and journalists to sell or loan the player, were Mickey van der Ven and James Maddison, who both received, no recommendations to move them on. Kevin Danso with 1, Jed Spence and Destiny Udogi with 2, Conor Gallagher with 3, Pedro Porro with 3, Kinski with 4, 2 of them were loans. Archie Gray, 5, all of which were loans. Matisse Tell, 6, 3 of which were loans. Berival, 7, 6 of which were loans. And Rodrigo Bentancur with 9. So those were our most protected and most wanted players to be around the squad going into next season. And, if you're listening to that carefully, you'll have noticed that most people didn't want to lose Jed Spence, but we just sold him. Kinski had some support, but there were still some questions about whether his development is in the right place, with 2 podcasters advocating for loans. And I'm not going to call out, for the most part, who said what. I might in some places, but I don't know. I don't know. I'll see whether I feel comfortable with that later on. It made sense as well that some of these players were low, like Conor Gallagher. We just signed him. James Maddison, he's just come back from a major injury. Who's gonna take him on? And that was also true of players like Mo Kudus, Kulusevski, and Xavi. These were all low, but funnily enough, some people were advocating for trying to sell these players who were injured. I don't know what that says about the integrity of this data set. Those who my portfolio of podcasts that I analyzed that people wanted to move on, excluding those who were in the potential loan army, were Vicario with 30. So that's pretty much everybody said that Vicario should move on. Christian Romero had 26. So despite all the rumors around him and some of the bad blood that was circulating. There were at least 4 or 5 podcasters who wanted him to stay. He had the same number of people calling for him to leave as Radu Dragićin. Richarlison was up there too. 22 respondents or 22 sources wanted him to leave, as well as 19 for Pat Matassa. So it's funny that, we've got Romero on one side and Spence on the other, who were two players that I think we've all agreed are going for less than we'd expect, and were on very different ends of the spectrum. Jed Spence, people really wanted to keep, and Christian Romero, people seem to really want to go. And they're in kind of funny spaces. Christian Romero, we made expendable when we signed Van Hecke, and we signaled that we needed him gone, and I think clubs knew this. But with our sales in general, we've done pretty well with some of our younger players. Like the money we're probably going to get for Will Lancashire has been good. We made our money back on Radu Dragićin. But we're kind of still caught in this no man's land where clubs know that we have money. We're part of the Sky Six and we're spending money on Tonali and Fernandes. So when we pay for players, they can demand more. On the other hand, clubs seem to be, using our 17th place finish maybe as to undervalue what we're trying to do, and they know that we need to sell. And I get that this is incredibly frustrating, but in the end, players do leave clubs for what they're worth, what people are willing to sell and what we're willing to accept, sadly. I think before sales can really push through, we're going to have to, and push through at levels that we as fans deem acceptable, is going to have to be once we've rebuilt our brand name as such, as our sporting status. So moving on from that little rant about about selling players, João Paulinho, 15 people said that they didn't want to keep him, or 15 different blogs or podcasts said they didn't want to keep him. Which is funny because I feel like at the back end of the season, he was being considered as a player of the season contender. His experience was being lauded. And in the end, I think we started calling off that sort of love affair. It just cooled down. I was really expecting there to be a lot more blogs and articles that said, let's keep, blogs and podcasts that said, let's keep him. He played his heart out, but I think that maybe some of the rumors that we were hearing perhaps turned people's heads, hearing about Fernandes or Tonali. Like, are you really going to sit there and think, oh, I want Paulinho above them? I'm not so sure. 12 people wanted Ben Davies to go, which is funny because in the end he received a new contract. I'll admit I was one of the people who thinks he should go. I love Ben Davies, but if he gets any minutes this season, something's gone drastically wrong again. If we compare Archie Gray and Lucas Berval, both of them received a decent number of loans, 5 and 6. And somebody like the Game is About Glory, Milo, was suggesting that we actually consider selling Berval due to his tactical fit with Roberto De Zerbi's system and style of play. Excellent player, nobody's questioning that. But there was some, that was a concern that him and a few other podcasts actually expressed, was whether we should move, capitalize on Berval's value right now, especially after a good World Cup. Mikey Moore is the name on everybody's lips today because he just scored 2 goals against Hoffenheim, and 12 people thought he should go on loan, which means that around 18 wanted to keep him in the first team squad. And I feel like that's people, wishing for him to be a first team ready player based upon a very, very good season in Scotland. But if I'm being honest, I think the best thing for Mikey Moore is another consistent season of football for him to come back and be even stronger the season after next. He's still only, 18? And we're in a position where I'm not sure that we can offer him the stability that he might need to come into the squad and be at his best. But we'll see. Luka Vuskovic, a transfer that set off a bit of a nuclear bomb in the fan base, I feel. Kind of the great white hope of Tottenham Hotspur fans that he would come in and, replace Christian Romero. And that wasn't what happened in the end. He ended up going to Brighton for about £50 million. 12 people thought that we should loan him, but there was mostly shouts for his integration into the first team squad. And I think with that sale, we all saw that there was a lot of anger and frustration around like our youth policy and quite how aggressive we were being about this squad refresh. And honestly, how young players were handled this window is probably its own episode. You've got us selling Luka Vuskovic, you've got the conversation about Mikey Moore that I just brought up, the Gray versus Beraval comparisons that's happened frequently about who should be kept, who's better, Will Lancashire, there's a whole lot of stuff going on there. Manor Solomon, Tottenham's forgotten man. 15 people wanted him to leave, but from what I could tell, when he wasn't mentioned, it was either saying to sell him, but a lot of people seem to just forget that he was on the books, and this was potentially an issue with some of the younger and low-knee players. But yeah, I think that 15 is understating our affection for keeping Manor Solomon. Looking at the forward line, which I was mentioning earlier, was a frequent sort of area that people wanted to improve upon, especially with injuries, especially with like the lack of goals scored last season. So 22 sources, podcasts or blogs, preferred that we sold Richarlison, and 8 were calling for Solanke. And, they're very different profile fit players. And I do wonder if Solanke has maybe benefited slightly from being injured, that we haven't seen him as much in a Spurs shirt, and there are potentially excuses for his goal-scoring form. I feel like I fall into this category, whereas Richarlison was very available last year, and we could see his deficiencies on the ball. But in the end, he did end up scoring some goals. So they're two very different players, and it seems like as a fan base, there's a preference for moving Richie on, which I think probably most of you sat here screaming, saying, well, of course we knew that. 17 sources wanted Scarlett to leave, with most people preferring a sale. Again, this makes sense. Probably time for him to go off and spread his wings a bit like Will Lancashire has at Middlesbrough, who's pulling up trees at the moment. Speaking of Lancashire, Spurs by COYS, or Spurs by COS on YouTube, thought that we should sell him. He was the only person to say so. 11 people were calling for Lancashire to be loaned out, and several saying that he should stay in the first team, including several who wanted to sell Solanke and Richarlison, but keep Lancashire. And I think Sonny Snelling fell into that group. So it's an interesting sort of combination of players to keep and loan and sell. Nobody wanted Randall Kolo Muani. Many people didn't even talk about him. Of the non-Spurs podcasters, of which in the end it was really just Joe Tomlinson, I would say that his picks mostly aligned with the consensus, except that he wanted to sell Bentancur, which aligned with 8 Spurs podcasters, and to loan Beraval, of which there were 6. All right, so that's like a lot of data that I just talked you through. Thanks for letting me talk about an Excel spreadsheet to you for about 20 minutes. Let's try to figure out what we can learn from this exercise. Well, Spurs fans are not a monolith. What a shock. And disagreements are common, even on topics on which you think that we might agree. Case in point being Romero. 26 people wanted him to go, but a few wanted to keep him, pointing to his, quality and leadership. And this is a guy who's been targeted by fans, commentators, possibly even the officials, but some people still wanted to rebuild a bridge with him, which is fair. I got the impression that most people rated him, but agreed that it's time for us to go our separate ways, but no, not for everybody. So looking at the numbers for each position, forwards and defence were most targeted, with 10.5 and 9, votes, I guess, for each cluster of players on average. The geometric mean was about 5.5 hard sells of some effect, either listening to or actively finding buyers for a player. So each podcast or blog was saying there's about 5 players we should sell. If you include loanees as well, or non-renewals, there was about 10.5. Nice one, Cyril. In fairness, only called for 6 outgoings in total, including loans, and so maybe that reflected some cynicism about whether or not ENIC would commit to improving the squad, similar to what I mentioned earlier with the Spurs Show. And it just looks like many were ready for this painful rebuild that was threatened by Poch, but in the end, from what we've learned, is that the players they've grown attached to, due to character, their potential, like Luka Vuskovic, or the moments that they brought to us, were quite pissed off when that reality came around for their favourite players. So you got to remember, all these squad audits were performed before we started selling players, and in fact, even before we started signing them in earnest. I did go back and listen to a few podcasts in preparation for recording this episode in the kind of middle period of the window. And I was listening to Dr. Tottenham just after we signed Tonali, and I thought they did a really good job framing the window at that point of time and posing some interesting questions. So these included, is all this stuff that's happened with signings coming in and kind of the ruthless transfers because Daniel Levy was holding us back? Is this what we always should have been, with Vasconi pointing to our history of beating, the likes of Manchester United, to Paul Gascoigne, to Darren Anderton, to us bringing Gary Lineker back from Barcelona? Were we blind to some of the changes that were happening last season, like signing Xavi, like signing Conor Gallagher on big wages? We've seen that continue on now with Tonali, Fernandes. Is this because of a disastrous season? Did we not see the forest for the trees that was happening last year? So should we begin to trust ENIC, like Flav suggested? And are the Lewises in a new era, or are they just reacting to a near catastrophe? So yeah, that was a really concise way of looking at the window, and I'm glad that I went back to that. All right, so I think I promised to list my keep, sell, and loans so that I'm not, so that I'm fully transparent. And so I wrote these down in a piece of paper or something at the start of the window in anticipation of recording this type of episode later. So I felt that we should keep Kinski, Porro, Spence, Danso, Van der Ven, Udogi, Gray, Gallagher, Beraval, Madison, Xavi, Tell, Odebear, Kudus, Kulusevski, and Solanke. I believe we should loan Vuskovic, Moore, and Lancashire. I haven't talked about some of the other younger players, and I apologise for that, but this would have been a very, very long episode, and I didn't want to do that. I didn't think we should keep or renew Basuma, Ben Davies, Colin Mwani, and Paulinho, and I thought that we should sell Vicario, Romero, Dragishin, Bentancur, Sarr, Solomon, Richarlison, and Scarlett. So I had 8 hard sells, but the highest was whoever Rich Footy was reacting to. He had 9. So I had a policy of no one is untouchable for the right price. When I was looking at this transfer, I did think that we needed like a lot of turnover. But it's funny to see who people wanted to protect and who they didn't. So I hope this was informative. At the very least, it was probably confusing. But, if there was something that you disagree with or you think I got wrong, yell at me in the comments or on Blue Sky, and then send this podcast to your mates and tell them to subscribe, and then yell at me in the comments. You can follow me on Tottenham Hotspur on Blue Sky. Yell at me on there. Email me your yells at tottenhamhotspur@gmail.com. And, enjoy the start of the season. We're a week out. I'll try to record something after the Brentford game. And yeah, just, have a good time. I do think that all of these ins and outs that we've experienced it's really exciting. It's very cool to be a part of it and to see it bubble up in real time. So enjoy it, whether you're watching at the stadium, whether you're, going to watch it at TV, watch it at your local pub, whatever. Have a good time, hug your mates, and come on, you Spurs.
podcast about Tottenham. Do I want to know why? They might contain insight, but mostly delusions. If I hear one more, I might die. They don't like Levy and they don't like Enoch. They pine for Moo and Conte. Someday we'll like 'em, old Tottenham Hotspur, the podcast clout chasers and me.